Hello and welcome to Speak Up, Listen Up, Follow Up, the podcast from the National Guardian's office. In this series, we're exploring the role leaders play in fostering a healthy speaking up culture and making speaking up business as usual. In this, our final episode, Dr. Jayne Clark, National Guardian for the NHS, speaks to Marie Gabriel CBE, the chair of the North East London's integrated care system.
We have to make sure that Freedom to Speak Up is part of integrated teams where people are coming together, organisations to deliver services to ensure that they're safe.
In this conversation, Marie explains her plans for Freedom to Speak Up's role within an ICS structure and shares practical tips to leaders on how they can ensure all board members understand their responsibility to support and reward speaking up. We hope you enjoy this. Over to Jayne.
Well, good morning, Marie, and it's an absolute privilege to have you here on our podcast for the NGO, Speak Up, Listen Up, Follow Up. And I wonder if I could start by asking you a very simple but such an important question. What does freedom to speak up mean to you?
So for me, freedom to speak up is actually really essential. It is all about safety, but it also defines the organisation that you're in, because for freedom to speak up to work, you must have a culture that is open, honest, curious and inquiring, and having effective speaking up structures, reporting, learning in your organisation means you're creating an environment where staff and actually people who use our services, who staff are advocates for, can actually feel and can evidence that their insights and views are not only heard but valued, and acted on. I think that is really important to me.
That's a fantastic definition, Marie, and I'm just particularly the acted on. So because so often I think people feel that they can speak up, but then there's like, so what happens to it? Where does it go? Is it affecting change? Is it making the place a better place for delivery of services or for workers in terms of how they're working? So I love that definition. Thank you so much. I wondered if I could ask you whether you've ever had cause, obviously not the details, but cause to speak up yourself, or you've had people speak up to it, either a good or not a good experience.
I think that what I would like to look at is people who've spoken up to me. I think I spent my career trying to find ways, either through union involvement or being involved in staff networks, to find ways of speaking up, to explore people who've spoken up to me. And so I've been directly involved in resolving a freedom to speak up a case because it involved a senior executive member of my team when I was chair of an organisation. And also as a chair, I've coming directly to me, and I've had someone come directly to me when freedom to speak up actually hasn't worked. And so for me, in both of those situations, it was about enabling resolution. And the first one was resolved, in conversation that involved the senior executive. But actually, what that was so valuable for me as a chair was that I got to see the freedom to speak up process firsthand. I got to see the courage it took for the individual to speak up. I got to see the anxiety that the person that was involved in that speaking up process experienced. And I got to see the wonderful work of the Guardian in terms of trying, how they listened and made sure that the individual was heard and that there was the action that we spoke about earlier as a result of that. I think the case came to me. Again, there was resolution, and I won't go into detail of that because that becomes identifying. But what was really important for me as a chair was that it illustrated to me that freedom to speak up wasn't working as well as I thought it had in that organisation. So that meant me personally making sure that we looked again at how freedom to speak up was being promoted, encouraged and welcomed in the organisation, to think about what more structures and support and different ways we could have in terms of accessing speaking up, and also we put in some additional tools, so we had more champions, and champions that reflective of the workforce.
That is so valuable, Marie, and just knowing, with you being a chair of, my next question is going to be around the integrated care systems, but a chair who believes in the importance of setting that right, and who's had that experience of helping to resolve, taking accountability for resolving issues that workers have raised to you. You really understand this, and it sounds to me like you're someone who absolutely sees the value and wants to set that culture. So my next question is around looking to the future, and integrated care systems, by the time this podcast is aired, will be legal functioning entities, and you will no longer be the designate chair, you will be the absolute chair. For you, how do you see speaking up sitting in an integrated care system, and what's your role going to be in this?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it's not really the future. We've been developing for quite a number of years now, and so although we're getting new teams of staffing and we're having new governance structure, freedom to speak up and the arrangements that we have in place have already been part of that conversation. So my chief people officer has only been in post, I think this is our second week. We've already had a discussion about freedom to speak up. And I've already identified that one of my newly appointed NEDs will be the Freedom Speak Up champion on the board. In fact, it's the only champion that I'm going to have on my board. But critically, all of us as integrated care boards and integrated care systems on their culture, the culture of the organisation itself, but also the culture of what the system should look like. And so we want to make sure, I want to make sure that this culture includes visible and evidence leadership with underpinning resources and skill development and responsibility accountabilities that will illustrate that freedom to speak up is not only welcome, but encouraged. And also a culture where there's an effective dialogue across the layers of the organisation and within the system. So in the new world of integrated care boards and integrated care systems, it's about how do you freedom to speak up is part of primary care networks, provide a collaborative, place-based partnerships. We have to make sure that freedom to speak up is part of integrated teams where people are coming together from different organisations to deliver services to ensure that they need to make sure that freedom to speak up is part of our learning, part of the way in which we triangulate information about how we're performing as a system and how we're performing as an organisation. And I think, of course, freedom to speak up will be part of our people. And I think, of course, freedom to speak up will be part of our people board and our people plans and our workforce planning. But I think it's actually more than that. It has to feature in lots of different ways. So even if you think about our digital strategy, how people can act free to speak up in new and different ways using the opportunity of digital should be a core part of that too, as well as being aware that for some people that we employ, access to digital is not a given. So we have to be really innovative. And finally, I think when I think about integrated care systems, is the way in which we're going to work with each of our equality networks to ensure that all staff, all of the time, feel that their ability to raise concerns and to work with the organisation or the system to solve them is actually something that we are getting right.
So valuable, and there's so much in what you've just said there. And when I listen back to this podcast, there's a lot in there. What I really I could pick out lots of items, but one of the ones that I really want to focus in on is this all people having the ability to speak up and the importance for getting the culture of that right. And we know that there are many barriers to people speaking up. The barrier of fear of nothing happening. You've talked about, the feedback, the acting on it. So that's still a big fear of many people that gets in the way of them speaking up. There's the fear of detriment, and we know that from our recent survey of Guardians is still a fear and is still actually happening. And one of the things that I wondered, because you're also the chair of the Race and Health Observatory, and we know that there are, from protected characteristics, including ethnic minority backgrounds, but lots of protected characteristics can get in the way of people speaking up. So I wonder for you, what your message is to leaders, who might be listening to this podcast. How can they ensure, what practical tips to ensure that all workers are enabled to speak up if they need to, through the various routes, not just the Guardian route, but through HR, through line managers, through all the different routes, patient safety, that people can speak up.
I think the very first thing to do is acknowledge the impact of inequality and discrimination when you're talking to freedom to speak up. So you ensure that in your narrative, when you're discussing it, you actually highlight that you know and you understand all staff to come forward and to speak up. I think it's about understanding where the data, the information, the insight around freedom to speak up. So who is actually speaking up and who isn't speaking up, and actually actively working with, as I spoke about before, your quality networks, but also your managers and your senior team, to target those groups of staff who are not actually communicating. I think it's also about the case studies that you use. I'm sure that all of us will use case studies to illustrate how we welcome freedom to speak up and how action resulted in that, and actually thinking about how you can use the case studies, even if it's from your partner organisations, because we're very new organisations, to actually illustrate how diversity and tackling discrimination has happened through freedom to speak up. So actually it's a worthwhile route to ensure equity, and equality. And I think it's about who you appoint, not only in terms of your Speak Up Guardian, but in terms of the champions that I think most of us are developing, across teams, to ensure there's a diversity within that, so that people can go to who has a similar lived experience to them.
That's so helpful, thank you. And the other issue that you talked about in your previous answer was around using different methods, different ways of encouraging people to speak up, including digital. And I think that's very exciting. As you say, though, it can't be one method. It comes back to disadvantage and discrimination. If there are certain parts of the workforce who don't have access to digital, then clearly only having that wouldn't be appropriate at all. You've been a leader in healthcare for many years now, Marie, and I wondered if you had any particular things that you've tried to encourage your teams to speak up that have been really successful, or things that you've tried that haven't been as successful.
So I think one of the things that is making sure, because my team is the board, that the whole board understands their responsibilities in terms of freedom to speak up. So the training that you've developed, and the same will happen with my new board as I assemble that. So I think that sort of making sure people understand their responsibilities and accountabilities has been successful, I think. I think that there's also been success in terms of making sure you've got a champion on the board, in making sure that every board report pack has a report on freedom to speak up. So you're signalling to the organisation that is appropriate, and that every year I will have people coming. I have staff presentation. I have staff presentations at my board, and one of those will be around a speaking up experience, so that you're really highlighting to the organisation. The other thing that's really valuable is when you go on visits and walkabouts to senior leaders, and asking about freedom to speak up when you're speaking teams and individuals, to show that this is important and something that's encouraged, and I think that is really important too. So those, and actually make it part of your culture and your culture improvement strategy. So those are things that tend to work well. I think the things that I've tried are where we've tried to ensure that all staff all the time do speak up, and there will be barriers within your organisation that will stop staff from doing that. So even though you say, as a senior leadership team, this is really important, their experience within teams means that it will take too much courage. They've seen examples where people have spoken up and that's not been taken forward, or that has been lessened. And I think you have to be really aware of that and actually discuss that. It's about how you support and enable those people who lead teams, who won't be in senior leadership positions, who have a lot of pressure on them. And my experience of seeing how a senior executive responded to a freedom to speak up incident made me understand the need to support those line managers in actually being open and valuing speaking up, and realizing that this is part of them learning as managers and developing as managers, and actually embracing what people are saying, because it's all about improvement. It's improvement of their service, but it's also improvement of them as leaders.
So true, and I think it is an absolute change for some people in that mindset that feedback is not a criticism. Feedback is an opportunity to learn and develop and be better, and that's that growth mindset that we talk about that is so important and you're describing. I wondered if I can just go back to talking a little bit about your new board, because you talked about that earlier. You will be a new board. We have produced with Health Education England our third piece of training. This piece is aimed at leaders, and I wondered if you had any plans of undertaking that training and using it alongside the new policy that came out around freedom to speak up, policy and guide report boards, and came out at the end of June. So I wondered if you had any plans to use those as a board, and how you might be doing that to encourage other boards to do similar.
So I've undertaken the training myself. For some of it, I had to think about previous organisations, because I'm talking about a new organisation, and it really made me to think more about what happened in the clinical commissioning group, the North East London Clinical Commissioning Group, around freedom to speak up, and what learning we need to take as a board from there. So I think that's one of the things. And yes, I'm expecting, or will be encouraging all my board members to undertake that training. And some of that will be quite interesting, won't it? Because they may be organisations such as voluntary sector organisations, who have a voluntary sector rep, who may not have participated in freedom to speak up training before. So it will provide with that varied representation around the board, table. I think some new and interesting insights to help us develop freedom to speak up in new ways by people taking that training.
That's brilliant, Marie, and I really look forward to having further conversations with you about how that's going and what work you're doing in that culture space to develop your culture. I wonder if I could just finish this. I don't want to finish. I'd like to carry on my conversation with you for a considerable time longer. But so what is your Speak Up pledge for us and for our listeners, please, Marie?
Okay, so I think that we are defined by an open, honest and learning culture which values, encourages, supports and rewards speaking up.
Wow, that is such a powerful pledge. I thank you, and I look forward to seeing how that is delivered. Thank you so much for speaking to me this morning. It's been a fantastic conversation. I hope it's been a great help to our podcast listeners, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Jayne. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Marie, for taking the time to come on our podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this series. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. We welcome your feedback, so please like, rate and comment. Thanks for listening.